Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today, my guest on Wealth Formula Podcast is Benjamin Hardy. Now, Ben has been the #1 most read writer on Medium.com since late 2015. His work has been read by over 50 million people. That is amazing, and has been featured on Forbes, Fortune, Psychology Today, and many others. He has grown his email list, and this is just remarkable, from 0 to nearly 400,000 followers in the past 3.5 years with 0 paid advertising. So he's got some decent content, I guess. Most recently, and one of the things we really want to talk about today, he's authored the internationally best-selling book, Willpower Doesn't Work. Ben, welcome to Wealth Formula Podcast.
What's up, man? Glad to be here with you.
Great. Well, listen, I want to talk about Willpower Doesn't Work because a lot of people are talking about this book. It is I think it's a very useful mindset type book. So let's just start with this. Why did you write this book? Why did you start thinking about it?
Yeah, absolutely. A few kind of key events in my life led me to really thinking about this subject from a different angle. Because obviously, intuitively, as a Western thinker, willpower, is something that we all aspire towards. It's something that, we all would think we would want, and we want more of it. And that's actually when I was going into my PhD program in psychology, I specifically wanted to study willpower under Dr. Roy Baumeister, who's kind of the leading psychologist on the subject. But I'll just kind of share very briefly some events in my life that have led me to thinking differently about it. So I grew up in a really rough, and I talk about this in the book, really rough situation. Parents got divorced. My father went down a really dark path for a long time, and really I couldn't be in his life. Drugs and stuff. He's actually turned his life around in the past few years, which has been amazing. And we've got a great connection now, but he went down a really dark place, and I just had basically no stability. And as a result, fell into a lot of traps, like in high school and stuff, and just went down a lot of bad paths myself. And I found myself about a year after high school, I barely graduated, didn't have a job, was living at my cousin's, playing 14 hours of World of Warcraft every day, and just doing nothing, eating Little Caesars pizza, drinking Mountain Dew, just totally nowhere, had no direction. And I was extremely unhappy. And ultimately I started just running a little bit with my cousin, and I started just doing a little bit of exercise just to give myself something to do. And I started to think about my life and realizing that the life I had was not the life I wanted. I ended up serving a 2-year humanitarian church style mission where I just did a lot of church service, did a lot of just helping people, just literally focusing on helping people. And in that time, I read a lot of books, a lot of personal development, a lot of business, a lot of philosophy, a lot of religion. And I started journaling a lot. I filled stacks and stacks of journals, just documenting my experiences. And I really experienced a huge change during this period of time. When I came back home, I was really shocked to find that everyone back home was still the same. And this was after a 2-year experience where I went through a lot of change.
Yeah.
And I came back home and I felt like everyone was still kind of in the same place. And actually my leader, the boss / leader on this mission experience, he told me at the end of it, he said, Ben, the worst thing you can do after an experience like this is to go back and be the person you were before. Cause I did change my life. And so I realized that if I had stayed around these same friends, my high school buddies and stuff, they had the same mindset, same even language, you know what I mean? That I would quickly revert back to the person I was. And so that was one big experience. The more recent one, aside from just studying psychology for the last 10 years, is, becoming a foster parent of 3 kids. We became a foster parents about 4 years ago. And it's really crazy when you take kids from a really rough environment. Basically these kids were heavily neglected, parents were on drugs. They weren't going to school. You take kids from basically an environment with no opportunity and you put them in an environment with a lot more opportunity and you watch them change. And I changed as a result. And so those were some of the big experiences that led me into thinking about the power of environment versus the power of willpower.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's jump into some of the concepts, which I think are obviously we're not going to, it's tough to cover a whole book, but I mean, just some highlights and some larger concepts. one of the things that you talked about in general is that environment beats willpower. Give us an example of that.
Cell phone addiction.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Caffeine addiction.
Right.
American obesity. I mean,
right.
How many examples do you need? Depression levels are skyrocketing. We live in an exponentially changing world. I think a lot of the people on this podcast, heavily educated, very successful group of people know that, the world is changing so fast with technological acceleration and globalization that the environment, it's very stimulating, it's intense. And willpower, another definition of willpower, another word for willpower is decision fatigue. Basically, it's the idea that the more decisions you have to make, the less quality they become. And, we live in a world now with infinite choices, decisions, and options. And so people's willpower gets sapped pretty quick in today's world. So people are, what we see now is addiction rates and depression and all these things, anxiety just skyrocketing.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things I think you talk about is that every environment has an agenda. And the idea, I guess, would be similar in that, if you have if you're trying to get some work done and you're sitting by your smartphone with all your social media on there, et cetera, what you're doing is giving yourself an out, right? You're giving yourself an option. With that environment, you're giving yourself the opportunity to just simply tune out, lose focus, and check Facebook or something like that, rather than to continue working, right?
Totally. Yeah. Most people are unconscious. Well, we're all behaving very unconsciously most of the time. So the goal is to create an environment where you can unconsciously operate at desired levels. But in the case of the cell phone in your room, if most people are honest, they're probably unconsciously triggered to check their phone a lot more than they want, even if they're just chilling on their computer, unconsciously triggered to hop on Facebook or social media or just, people are so distracted and they don't realize it's because their body has literally become addicted to the neurochemicals, whether it be the dopamine or something. And so the physical body is the unconscious mind. That's one thing a lot of people don't really realize, that they think the unconscious is like a floating essence, but it's their physical body, and their physical body literally gets addicted to chemicals. And that's why it subconsciously jumps into, and so you really need to think about it. So there's a really good quote that in a lot of ways I based the book on, and it's from Dr. Marshall Goldsmith. It came from a book called Triggers. And the quote is, "If we do not create and control our environment creates and controls us." And so the idea is, if you want to live your values, if you want to achieve goals, if you want to not have to consciously control your behavior, which is basically another definition of willpower, is just having to consciously control what you're doing. It's so much better to make the decision up front to set up your environment so that it resonates with what you're doing. So you don't have to battle against it, so that you can just unconsciously act in desired ways.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned like addiction, for example, and, what is addiction? At the end of the day, it's sort of just an extreme version of what our decision-making process is like all day long in a non-pathological state, right? I mean, you get these little miniature dopamine hits all the time.
It's impulsive, though. That's one of the core reasons why it becomes addiction. It's extreme behavior because it's impulsive.
Right. But to a lesser degree, in the non-pathological end of that spectrum, is the use of a phone when you should be, I do this all the time, right? I mean, we have these little triggers, and I don't consider it an addiction necessarily, but it is. It is an addiction. It's just one that probably doesn't harm me quite as extensively as, some people who have, impulsivity that creates drug addictions or, et cetera. So let's talk about some of the other, some of the strategies that that you use to, I guess to train Pavlov's dog, right? I mean, how do you untrain some of these problems and divert your attention from these if they've become a real problem for you? I mean, it's as simple as controlling. There's some people obviously who have some significant impulse issues. So you talk a little bit about creating triggers to prevent self-sabotage. What's that all about?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many practical strategies, obviously. Happy to go
Right.
into as many of them as you want.
Sure.
The whole idea of creating triggers to prevent self-sabotage comes from an idea in psychology called implementation intentions. Basically, the idea is just to have a pre-planned response when you get triggered. Like it's planning for failure because you know that something's going to pop up towards a big goal. It's knowing that you're not going to be able to control every situation, and so sometimes something's going to happen, and it's planning ahead for those situations and knowing what you're going to do. So you create an if-then scenario. If this happens, if I get triggered to do this thing, then this is going to be my response. And this is how elite endurance athletes go a lot further than most people, because basically with like big elite endurance events, if you do not like pre-plan the conditions in which you're going to quit, you're going to quit way before you could. I mean, you're going to quit way before you have to. Like basically what endurance athletes say is like, I will not quit unless, for example, like I lose my eyesight, but if you don't have a pre-planned response, then pretty much the moment you experience some form of resistance, you'll probably cave. And so if you don't know what you're going to do beforehand, the situation's probably going to win in this case,
Yeah, I'm curious what, I know you're about to complete your psychology a PhD, and my background, includes neurosurgery and neuroscience and things like that. I'm curious on if we know what the chemistry or the physiology in that particular strategy would be, right? I mean, if you've got dopaminergic hits that are creating this impulsivity and or satisfying the impulsivity or whatever, what are you doing effectively to change your body's chemistry or your brain's chemistry when you're diverting?
I mean, how I look at it is like the brain is, a prediction machine. The whole,
Right.
the goal of the brain is to predict.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you do something different, so a lot of people, given that the trigger exists, probably means that, they've caved in the past. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right.
But,
Strengthening
basic,
axons is part of
yeah,
it, right? And then
yeah, I mean,
creating new pathways of your brain, and maybe some alternative pathways, and strengthening those instead. I think potentially that's a way to look at it.
totally. Yeah. I mean, the only way to grow is to change. The only way to change is to change your behavior, which creates unpredictability in the brain. Like you do something uncertain, the brain doesn't know what to do.
Yeah, and here's a related interesting thing that I always found interesting when I was in neuro, the idea of neuroplasticity, right? So if you have, for example, if you're right-handed, right, and you break your arm and you can't write, using your right hand for a while, if you look at functional MRIs over time, even if you're an adult, the left side of the left-handed part of your brain suddenly starts to light up. So we have this idea in traditional neurobiology that there is not a lot of plasticity or ability to change for people once they reach adulthood. But what we're finding more and more is that you really can change your physiology, and I think that's kind of what you're getting at with some of this behavioral stuff.
Just to add to that, there's a really good quote from Albert Einstein.
Yeah.
And he said that the measure of intelligence is the ability to change.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So let's see. And then in terms of, fundamentally what we're trying to do here is we're trying to remove the need for willpower. And that really means just taking decisions away, doesn't it? Ultimately, isn't that effectively what you're doing?
It's two things. It's actually making decisions, and then it's removing negative options. So,
Right.
One way of looking at willpower, is that it's a form of internal conflict. Like if you're triggered and tempted, for example, to eat a cookie, yet at the same time you're trying to train for like an event and you're really trying to get fit, or you're trying to have a six pack, there's a conflict there, right? Like so one of the, like, my favorite quotes is the idea that basically if you're required to use willpower, it means you don't know what you really want to do. Like you haven't actually made the decision. Like if you truly make a decision, like I'm no longer going to do this. Like one of the like Greek definitions of decision is to cut off alternative options. And so if you actually truly make a decision, which is something that, people aren't very good at these days, a true decision, then the decision's made. You don't have to have the internal debate. And if willpower is occurring, there's an internal debate. You're trying to figure out what you want to do. You're battling. It's like the kids trying to eat the marshmallow. They haven't decided in this case that they're either going to or they're not going to. Like they're caught in the middle. Right. So that's one thing. Is
make a decision like burning the bridge almost. Right?
100%. Yeah. I mean, nothing happens until after the bridges are burned. So right. one component is actually making a decision. The other half of that is, and it's required if it's a true decision, is to create an external environment that facilitates that decision. So that's where you actually eliminate bad options. There's a really cool quote I'll just share. It's from Jason Fried. He's the founder of Basecamp, which is a multi-billion-dollar company. Mm-hmm. So this is what Jason Fried said on a Tim Ferriss podcast episode. He said, "I'm pretty oblivious to a lot of things intentionally. I don't want to be influenced that much." It's the idea that like you purposefully, it's like the idea that good is the enemy of great. If you know what you want, then you want to eliminate negative inputs that are going to distract you, that are going to dissuade you. Like why deal with options that are below that are subpar? Just get those out of there so you can focus on what you want.
What's the, what I'm just curious in your own life, what are some of the things that, these strategies have helped you do?
Oh my gosh. Well, I mean, so there's a really simple, cool idea. It's, if it's not like no more yes, basically no more yes, it's either hell yes or no.
Yeah,
so
there you go.
Obviously saying no to really good opportunities. Just being willing to say no. Like that's a hard part about decisions. When you make a decision, you have to embrace the fear of missing out, and that's what a lot of people don't want to do. One of the things I talk about in Willpower Doesn't Work is an idea called forcing functions. Basically, it's about creating situational factors that force you to do what you want to do. So like one could be, if you want to get better at public speaking, you actually like sign up for a speech, like you actually sign up, you invest some money. It could be to like hire a coach. You basically put yourself in a position where you feel like you have to, and then you have a timeline and stuff. So, I mean, I apply that concept all the time to like get myself to move forward. My foster kids, for example, which we've adopted, actually, we adopted all three of them earlier this year. I mean, my whole life in a lot of ways kind of keeps me in check in ways that I want it to, like in order for me to live my values and my goals, like I've got to be a good husband and father, like they expect that. And there's an idea in psychology, which I talk about a lot in the book, and it's called the Pygmalion effect. But basically the idea is that the expectations of your environment, of those around you, in a lot of ways determines what you do and where you go. And so I've created a situation in a life that kind of keeps me where I want to be in a lot of ways. I have a lot of fluidness. I've got a lot of option. There's a lot of wiggle room, but like, yeah, I mean, my life keeps me keeps me on path,
Yeah. Yeah. And, as an entrepreneur too, and I know you and I are both part of a group with a lot of entrepreneurs in it. This is particularly important, kind of philosophy in general. I don't know if it's just entrepreneurs. I would say it's most people in life, but the idea of being able to just kind of say no all the time, not all the time, but to most things is critically important. Actually, Dean Graziosi, I remember it. I don't know if he said it on the show or he said it one other time that I thought was pretty impressive, was that he said saying yes got me to 10 million, and then he said saying no got me to 100 million, which I think it's really brilliant, because the reality is that as you start creating success, and whether that's in the in the entrepreneurial world, or for our group with you have a million different opportunities to invest in, I think you have to start figuring out what works and really focus on it. And saying no is hard, but it really can set you free.
Totally.
But anyway, Ben, the book is called Willpower Doesn't Work. And we will put show links to it. It's getting tremendous rave reviews everywhere. Super excited for you. And where else can we find, more of your content? I guess Medium, right? I mean, medium.com, is that the main?
You could just go to benjaminhardy.com. I actually have basically a reference page of all my most top, my top articles. Yeah, I mean, I've got all sorts of stuff on benjaminhardy.com. List of favorite quotes, different like online programs. So benjaminhardy.com is kind of the place to go.
Sounds good. And we will definitely add to that gigantic email list of yours. Anyway, Ben, thanks again for being on the show, and we'll be right back.